Okay, we are in Exodus 20 again.
Yep.
And maybe this commandment will be a little more popular than the last one we looked at least with this crowd. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. What do you think about that? Very important, Dahlia says. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You see so many children that don't respect their parents and don't treat them right and don't take care of them in their old age. But I just keep wondering, it's crazy because I know a few of them that are doing that to their parents. But their children are watching them and how they respond to their parents. They don't think it's going to come back and bite them in the butt. It's gonna.
The B-U-T-T-E, the butte.
I just don't understand.
And the glutox. Yeah.
Why they have to treat their parents so shabbily.
I think we have a lot of it where the grandparents are taking care of the grandchildren and not that they're not taking care of the parents.
Okay.
Maybe that's it. Maybe the parents did not take care of the children properly when they should have.
That's the truth.
Yes, there's some of that. There's quite a bit of that actually. I wouldn't say some, there's a lot of that. But the children weren't taken care of properly.
So it's a part of society. It's woven into the fabric of society. And if you take part of it out, kind of like if you don't keep the laws about gathering food correctly, you're going to have a hard time keeping Sabbath because you don't have the food. And if you don't, if the parents aren't creating an environment in which they are honorable, it makes it a really hard challenge for the children to honor them. And this commandment, like all of the commandments, I think, is kind of meant to work together and to, as we've said, it's not so much to create the Jewish community, the nation of Israel, but it is to protect and sustain the nation of Israel. As these commandments depart, the obedience to these commandments wanes, the well-being of the nation will wane and maybe even ultimately collapse. So it is an integral part of what is expected of the children, but at the same time, we're not told exactly what it means to honor, are we? What does it mean to honor your parents?
Well, I'm sure it means a lot. There's probably a lot of sides to that word. But the first thing would be to obey them. In my mind, anyway, you honor them by obeying their instructions.
Okay.
Whatever they might be. And I'm sure there's a lot more to that word
Okay.
than that particular part. But that strikes me first as the most idea.
Particularly when the children are children, when they are in the home and all of that.
If you're 10 years old and father says it's time to mow the lawn, mow the lawn. Don't fuss about it. I mean, we all did, right? That's in times past, but I mean, you're
That's why God gave dads belts, right?
Some mothers too. But nowadays, children are home at 30 years old and they still can honor their parents and mow the lawn.
Okay.
Now, wait a minute.
If you're going to be at home with your parents, you need to obey the rules. That's honorable.
Honor would be okay. I mean,
That's honorable. You're
My kids are 60 years old. I mean, it's scary, you know?
You don't want them moving back in with you?
Well, if they do.
That there's some things.
They might want more work than when they left, so,
It's not full up there now.
yeah. But, you know, I mean, we still talk. And I don't know that they necessarily, you know, I mean, we'll talk about situations or whatever, and so there's some, in my mind, there's some honor there that they even think about that. So I don't know that you ever get past the point of honoring your parents. You know, I mean,
What it looks like to honor them changes over time, doesn't it?
well, yeah, it does, certainly does. I mean, they, you know, they're gonna make their own decisions, but if they come to you and ask for your input, well, you can give them their input, and then they give your input, and then they make their own decision. But they've honored you in a way by asking what you think about a situation.
I have a really hard time making a big decision even now without talking to my dad first.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Wallace always talked about that, like when he was out in public and all, he didn't want to do anything to embarrass his parents. And all of that was from honoring them, you know, that, you know, I can't do something bad because it's going to flow a reflection back on my parents. So it's why'd you let this kid grow up that way? And I've always felt like that was the way he was honoring them.
That's just as last week we had a positive commandment finally, keep the Sabbath, being told positively what to do. Here's another positive commandment before we get to a bunch of negative commandments again, but another positive commandment, honor your father and mother. When we look at the negative commandments, we try to find a positive corollary. The negative corollary to honoring your parents might be do not dishonor your parents. What does that mean? Well, that all of a sudden, if we look at that as just being the exact opposite, then that can come out and give us a little bit of an understanding on that. Yes, sir.
It's just, there's an element of wisdom with your elders, whether it be your parents, your grandparents, you know, whether it be the founding fathers of our country or whatever. I mean, there's a thread of wisdom that has gone through all of society, and it's like it's to look for that and to respect that wisdom that our life, our culture, and things have been built on.
Okay.
As opposed to just
Reinventing the wheel every generation.
right. And, you know, and there may be some things that need to be changed, but that doesn't mean that you have to disrespect why people were the way they were. I mean, there are things that have changed over time, and we may look back and go, why did people ever do that? Well, there was a reason.
Yes.
And to respect those things in their time. It may not be appropriate now, but at the time that it was. And there isn't a need to disrespect that because things are different now than they were.
Every tradition was an innovation at some point.
Yes.
What we count on and we do all the time now, we think this is that way it's always been done. It hasn't always been done that way. I mean, for us, these are getting old-fashioned now, aren't they? A full-size laptop computer. Why? Because we carry I don't have it on me. We carry our computer around in our pocket now. Dolores is
Or not.
Dolores hacks into the Pentagon whenever she feels like it, though. So she can. Before these, there were the big computers. Computers used to take up buildings, basically, and they weren't as powerful as this dude right here. And before there were computers, there were abacuses. Or is it abaci? I'm not sure, but there were books. And before there were books, there were scrolls. I mean, the church is the reason we have books. The Bible, the word Bible is a book. You take the scrolls and you put them on, you stack them together, and you can read them and go back and forth and all of that, which is kind of how we like to use it today.
There was the oral tradition.
And before the scrolls, it was oral.
Of listening to the stories that your parents.
Sitting around a fire, gnawing on a piece of woolly mammoth. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I stumbled across this. Tradition is just peer pressure from dead people.
And some societies are much more under that influence than others, are much more susceptible to being the cultures that will not innovate. And usually it's because they haven't had a lot of contact with other cultures. But that's one of the reasons, sadly, that the Europeans could come over here and plow through the Indians the way they did, was the Indians revered their elders. They didn't want to do anything their elders hadn't done. Well, the Europeans, we may have thought they were very respectful to their parents, but they didn't mind, if not inventing, making better use of gunpowder and all these other crossbows instead of just longbows, et cetera, et cetera. So innovation makes people who will not innovate very vulnerable. And that's something to think about as we move forward as a congregation. We don't want to innovate. A lot of time we don't know anything different. We want it exactly the way it was when we grew up. First of all, it wasn't always the way it was when you grew up. It was different before then. And it's going to be different after you're gone. And it may need to be different right now. That just because it's traditional doesn't mean we can't change. There was a movie made. There's always a movie. There was a movie made, I guess it's probably close to 20 years ago. I didn't look it up. But it was based on an old novel by Somerset Maugham called The Painted Veil. It was made, like I said, I think within the last 20 years. And they went over it and they filmed the whole thing in China. And that's where the movie was set. The book was set. And they wanted the rice fields to look a certain way according to their filming schedule. And when movies may have a set of schedule, they've got a lot of reasons. I may have told you this story before, but they've got a lot of reasons for setting up that schedule. And most of them have to do with money. And they get over there and it won't work with the Chinese farmers. That's not when they plant their rice. And if they follow their traditional way of planting their crop, they won't have the rice where the movie makers need it to be for the movie. So they have to make a deal with the Chinese farmers, which is, we will pay for your entire crop ahead of time and let you keep and sell whatever it is you actually produce. And I don't know how it turned out, how the crop turned out, but the Chinese, especially these, old school farmers, they are growing their crops based on the way their ancestors have grown their crops as far back as maybe before the time of Christ. As far back as certainly anyone can remember, and usually a lot farther than that. And it's traditional. Now, that being said, that tradition probably came about for a reason. And it probably didn't come about and become such a fixed thing immediately. It probably evolved over time, and they found out, for us, with this rice and this land, this is the best time to plant. And maybe now with more technology, with different varieties of rice, et cetera, it would be different. But they haven't done that. They hadn't at that point yet, anyway.
Another example of that, just doing it because they did it before, is the story of the little girl coming up to mom and mom cutting off part of the roast. And the little girl asked the mom, "Why did you do that?" Well, because mom always did it. So she goes to ask grandma, "Why did you do that?" Because I didn't have a big enough pan. So there was a reason why it started. Now, that reason may not apply any longer, but there was a reason for it, like you're saying.
And, it's it's a balancing act, really. And I think, and I don't want to get too political. Y'all probably think I'm too political all the time anyway. But, there's a lot of attacks right now on our United States Constitution right now. And they bring up the fact that it has the 3/5 compromise, which recognized slaves, not with rights, but for population purposes, for distributing Congress people and all of that stuff, congressmen, and all that, as 3/5 of a human being. They count it as 3/5 of a person, 60% of a person. So for every 5 slaves you had, you got 3 people towards being a state, being accepted, having members of Congress, things like that, electoral votes. It's all based on that 3/5 compromise. Now that's a horrible part of our history, isn't it? To look at human beings and say, well, you're 60% of a person. And a lot of black folks would say we weren't treated that well, nearly that well. We were treated as 0% of a person. And that's, certainly has some validity to it. At the same time, there's a lot of things in the Constitution that point towards and eventually make slavery and discrimination based on race and gender and other things untenable. It didn't bring about that change right then and there, but maybe it sets the nation on a course to where eventually those things pass away. Now, I'm not telling you that's how you should look at it. I'm suggesting it as a possible way to look at it. And if you think the Constitution was passed by racists and it's so inherently racist, it needs to be done away with, that's certainly your prerogative. I think that's your perspective. I think it's going to be difficult to bring about that change, but maybe it'll happen. I don't know. So, yes, sir.
I said that I'm thinking of the children of Israel and their relationship with God. That God has presenting his power, his authority, and his desire for them to do what he wants them to do more than once. And he calls them stiff-necked people.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to be a part of human nature. I'm not saying 100%, but in general, that man, for whatever reason, and I guess as a former manager in Bonneville Power, I had to do some things. One of them was cut back on overtime. I had a guy that wanted to go from Redmond, Oregon down to the station close to California. I told him, you can't stay there and work overtime anymore. But if I work overtime, I only have to stay one night, not 2 nights. And that's cheaper, isn't it? And I had to explain to him very carefully, I've got directions from above that says we don't have any more overtime money. So it comes out of 2 different pots. It doesn't make sense to him.
That sounds like the government at work.
Yeah, the way they account for the money, you have to follow that. Well, I mean, it was really, I was having to really push hard to get him to make that change because he had in his mind all these years I've done it this way. And sometimes, not sometimes, I do it myself. To serve the citizens, doing it a certain way, watching how the community is served. They forgot to do this or they forgot to do that. But it gets done. So is it me or is it, there's a balancing act there. I got to think about my own reaction to actions and see, is it me that's problem or is what I see not right?
I had a friend he was at the time a minister in Ohio, and he was talking about a church across the state line in West Virginia, and they were the one cuppers, because that's Jesus took a cup and then they passed it around. We're going to take 1 cup. We're all going to drink from it. And they did that for decades and lost people over it and all that. Then there was a outbreak of viral meningitis in the community. And they went to multiple cups, disposable, just as quickly as they could, because time to innovate. We're going to kill each other. So there's innovation frequently. The old saying, invention is necessity is the mother of invention. At some point, you realize you have a need and you have to move past what you already have. And we've already talked a little bit, and we'll see it in a few weeks even more clearly, the evolution of the understanding of these commandments by God's people. And one thing, we do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Well, for Israel, that was the name of I am who I am. For us as Christians, that's Father, Son, Spirit. I mean, that's God. So to take the name of the Lord in vain is also taking the name of Jesus in vain. Jesus warns against blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. So it evolves, it changes a little bit. And what were you going to say something, Tammy? You seem like you had something to say earlier, and okay, she thought better of it, perhaps. I don't know. But there, it is. It is, I think, important to kind of look at the culture into which this commandment goes as well. A culture in which the father is almost totally uninvolved with the raising of the children. Mark talked about dad asking you to mow the lawn. I don't know if he's talking about his dad asking him to mow the lawn or him talking to his boys about mowing the lawn, but, that kind of interaction. Well, that just probably wouldn't have happened back then. First of all, they were in the desert. They didn't really have lawns, but they didn't have the same kind of housing situation we did. But really the grown men just kind of they would, in the social setting, the house was the woman's prerogative. It was the wife's prerogative. She ran it. The women and children were kept apart. The men they're not out there, changing diapers. They're not out there staying up night with sick kids. They're not getting them up and getting them off to school. They're not doing the things that we think, fathers should help with, or maybe even, or sometimes forced to take the lead on. These are fathers in a way that's very similar to what you see a lot in social animals in the animal kingdom. These are kind of like the male lion. He's got a pride. You got several girls and a bunch of cubs. And when the girls go out and hunt and kill something, Big Daddy shows up and eats first. He takes the lion's share. And if anybody's got anything to say about it, they can talk to Big Daddy about it. And they shut up pretty quick. But the mamas get up there, try to get on it first and get the cubs up and get everybody else eating before Big Daddy shows up. It's almost like it's adversarial. And we see it even in the story of Jacob with Rachel and Leah. And the story, we talked about it a long time ago now, but the story of the mandrakes. Joseph is out in the fields tending the flock. They come back home. The mandrakes get used as between the wives, between Rachel and Leah, as to who sleeps with Jacob that night. Jacob just comes back from work. Well, whatever. I'll sleep wherever. He doesn't care. He's a man. What goes on in the home, that's the wife's business. I'm out tending the flocks. I'm out building generational wealth. I'm not coming back here. I'm not wiping snotty noses. I'm not doing all the little stuff that we expect fathers to do. What does that do towards the children? Well, it makes it kind of really, in a way, very easy to honor dad. Because dad, there's this distance, there's this kind of inherent reverence, there's this, he's not the one, discipline me. He's not the one. There's some of the biblical concepts of fathers disciplining children. And that's not the projection of fatherhood that Jesus gives us, is it? Jesus gives us the father laying down with all the children around him. And when the friend comes over knocking on the door late at night, I need some food for a guest. I don't want to get up. I don't want to wake up all these kids. In the ancient world, a dad doesn't want to be awakened by a kid with a little problem getting through the night without having an accident. That's not the dad's problem. That's the mom's problem. So it's kind of easy in a way, though, that this distance, this space, it's easy to honor a father who's really providing for you, and you don't really know him that well, but you look up to him. He's kind of your hero. But when you read the commandment, we are to honor our father and our mother. And the mother is the one kind of doing the menial tasks. And in a wealthy family, yes, she still has servants doing a lot of that stuff. But in a normal family, the mother's going to be cooking, and going to be cleaning, and going to be rearing the children. And what that looks like precisely, I don't know. It's going to be probably quite different than it looks like in our families. The whole dynamic is different. And it's easy, isn't it easy to take for granted the person who takes care of you all the time? If your mother could hand you a bill for everything she's ever done for you, every time she cooked for you, every time she did your laundry, every time she made your bed, every time she did anything for you, if your mother just handed you a bill and you had a payment due upon receipt, what's the number on that bill? Most of us have really good mothers, and so that we think about that being, not everybody has a good mother, do they? And certainly in our culture, not everybody has a good father. Not everybody does have the father. That's the big daddy line that's going out and trying to provide for the family, protect the family. This commandment doesn't really think about it. Some families have fathers who are absolute monsters to their own family, to their own wives and to their own children, doing unspeakable things to their own flesh and blood. This commandment isn't really it doesn't let us off the hook necessarily, but it supposes that the culture will be shaped by the overall commandments too. And within that culture, within a godly culture, as our culture has, some say, moved away from godliness. Some say maybe it's moving towards godliness. I haven't heard too many people suggest that, but maybe it's probably moving more towards godlessness. It gets harder and harder to do this, doesn't it? I mean, this is a commandment. Most of us had good parents, at least relatively stable parents. And so when we read this commandment, we try to be good parents ourselves if we have kids. This all makes sense. This all fits nicely. You know, it's a reminder. When dad gets older and he exasperates you a little bit, well, you have to honor him. When mom is alone in the nursing home, well, you better go visit her. This doesn't really it doesn't come across as such a simple thing to someone whose dad molested them, whose mother ran off and left, who didn't intervene maybe and protect. And I've known someone who was molested by their own mother. It happens. It may happen a lot more than we think, because when we have Mother's Day, when it comes up and all we do is talk about how wonderful mom is, that is easy for those of us with good mothers. It is really hard for people who did not have a good mother, for whatever reason. I mean, that's kind of like the whole most basic relationship. We kind of understand people who their dad wasn't around, or he just wasn't a very good person or something. But everybody's got to love their mama, don't they? Everybody has a loving mother. No, they don't. Are they exempt?
No.
It comes down, how do you honor them? What does it mean to honor them? There's kids right now who are Christians despite the wishes of their parents. Their parents don't want them to be Christians. Are they dishonoring their parents? We talked about the Sabbath a little bit last week. There's not a lot in the New Testament about truly keeping Sabbath. We know a lot of early Christians did because they were Jewish and they remained Jewish. After they became Christians, they would go to synagogue or temple on Saturday and then gather with other Christians on Sunday. They would be taught and preached to. When they were preached to, they preached the Old Testament. When they taught the gospel. There was this blending of the two cultures for quite some time. What does the New Testament say about honoring your father and your mother? What does Jesus say about honoring your father and mother? Jesus, let me stay behind. Let me bury my mother and father, and then I will come and follow you. Jesus says, that's right. You're supposed to honor your parents. You do that. Is that what Jesus said?
No, that's not what he said. He had let the dead bury the dead.
That's something we kind of gloss over. I think it's one of the most revolutionary things Jesus says in his whole ministry. Jesus, your mother and your brothers are here to see you. They think you're crazy. They want to take you home. My mother, my brothers, my sisters, are all right here. Robin said hi a while back. I didn't say hi to Robin, but Robin's tuned in. One of the ways you honor your father and your mother, and in this culture, one of the requirements of the Mosaic Law is when you die, you are buried when? As soon as possible, basically, the same day. How do you do that? How does a child bury his father or his mother? Yeah, the same day. He's got to be close by, doesn't he? He's not 2 time zones away. We talk about honoring our parents by taking care of them in their old age. My parents have made arrangements, and they made them intentionally so that we would never have to be the ones to take care of them physically. They spent money, they had planned on it, they advanced it for a long time. We don't want you to have to do this for us. What am I supposed to do? Go kidnap them, bring them? Oh, you're coming with me? You know.
You honor what they say.
You honor what they say? Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Part of what I'm thinking about right now would be, how did Jesus, as a man in this world, honor his mother and father? And I'm talking about, of course, his physical mother and his physical father. He was under their control.
Mhm.
He was growing up. There was a time, of course, when he was lost. He said, where my fathers were. But yet, there must have been something else there that we don't get all the story, but we get enough of it where it says he grew in stature and was well respected as a child. If I'm quoting it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
There was apparently some respect or enough respect shown by Jesus.
You know, Mary, when he's at the temple, Mary confronts him and says, don't you know your father and I were worried about you? Your father and I were worried about you. And he says, I am about my father's business. So whenever he looked at Joseph and Joseph tried to tell him what to do, he could say, you ain't my real dad. You know.
But yet prior to that, you don't see that seems to be the start of this change.
Mm-hmm.
But prior to that, you don't see anything of that nature.
The temple story is in Luke.
Right.
In Luke 14, verse 26, Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you have to hate your father and mother.
But he also made arrangements for his mother. When he was being taken to the cross, he made sure somebody was taking care of his mother.
It's an interesting story because we know Jesus had brothers.
Yeah.
Why didn't they step up? One thought is that they weren't actually his full blood brothers. Certainly they didn't have the same biological father, but they may have been Joseph's from a previous marriage and therefore would feel no obligation to marry. They may have also been cousins, and they're really close, and they all grow up together and everything, and they're basically like brothers, but still under no legal obligation. And I think this theory, this whole commandment, envisioned through the church, envisioned on this side of the cross, it does come to mean more than just your biological father and your mother. It does mean young men, honor the older men. Young men, take care of the widows, look at them as your mother, kind of. There is this, if this is a family. So when you're taking care, I'm here with y'all instead of with my parents. I'm here with y'all. And I'm still with my family. Plus, my parents don't really probably care of them. No, they do. I'm going to get to see them in a few weeks, so that'll be good. I think we also kind of looking at the promise, looking at it and treat it very carefully. This isn't meant to be like a contractual obligation. If I honor my parents, God, you've got to give me a long life and prosperity. All I got to do is honor my parents to have those things. That's not how it's working. The promise is, again, at a cultural level, a cultural that is respectful, that cherishes what Ed was talking about, the wisdom of the previous generations. I mean, again, don't reinvent the wheel every time. You don't have to start from ground zero. Getting back to the talk about the Constitution, I would suggest that if we did get rid of our Constitution and draft a brand new one, it's going to have a lot of problems too. In 10, 15, 20, 30 years, it's going to look archaic too. And the biggest problems, I think, with the Constitution are not the overarching principles of it. The biggest problems with it is when it gets really specific. Like you have a right to a jury trial if the matter contested is $20 or more. Well, if it's less than $20, you're not even going to go to small claims court for $20, are you? But you have a constitutional right to a jury trial in a civil case if the matter in controversy is $20 or more. Because $20
Used to be a lot of money, it's not.
You'll see Dolores just walking around throwing 20s around at everybody sometimes.
I don't have any money.
Oh, you don't. Not anymore. Yeah, if you do that. So this promise is, this is how you're going to be prosperous and successful as a nation in the land I'm giving you. And in the Exodus account, these two things are just absolutely intertwined. To be long-lived and to live in Canaan, that's the same thing. In Deuteronomy, it's presented a little bit different, so that your days may be prolonged and that it may go well for you in the land. It's like two different things, two separate blessings. In Exodus, they haven't had the wanderings yet, right? And God is really trying to bring this community together and say, this is how you protect this community. Moses reciting them 40 years later, after putting up with these people in the desert, is now he kind of bifurcates them a little bit. That you may do well, and you may live a long time, and you may remain in Canaan for a long time. It's like two separate things. It's all part, though, I think God's intention for his people is to live and experience real, deep, abiding shalom, peace. And that's not just absence of violence. It is absence of tyranny. It is absence of fear. It is a state of blessedness. That is what God wants for his people. It does not always happen, no matter how they treat their parents. At a cultural level, this is one of the things that will help. And I think we are seeing our culture, whether it needed to be protected or not, is up in the debate. But I believe our culture is being really strained right now. And one of the reasons is the breakdown of the traditional relationship between parent and child. I remember the first time I saw one of my friends backtalk his mother. And I will say, I'm not going to name names to get into specifics. I will say he was a few years older than me, and he was going through a very hard time. The whole family was going through a very hard time when he did it. And his mother just let it slide. I'm not saying I had never backtalked my mother at that point. I don't know that I ever talked to her the way he talked to her that time. And she didn't do anything. But that, again, they were going through a very difficult time. Sometimes the mother just has to be willing, or the parent has to be willing to endure the harm, deal with the insult or deal with the hurt rather than responding out of that hurt. But that was a striking memory to me. One I can still see it happening right now. I was like 12. So I was very young, and it still stands out to me. But since then, I've seen a lot of kids backtalk their mothers, and most of the people I meet have at least a slightly different relationship with their parents than I have with mine. And a lot of young people today, they may have a living arrangement with their significant other that is not in keeping with their parents' view on things. And when they go visit their parents, they bring their significant other with them, and they expect to fully cohabitate in the parental home. And I got a lot of friends my age who basically cannot understand why I don't tell my parents how things work. I'm never going to tell my parents how things work. That's just not going to happen. If you get to tell your parents how things work, good for you. I don't get to do that. I don't think it is good for you, though, really. And I'm not getting into anybody's personal choices and all that stuff. I'm not trying to get into moralizing. But I am saying we are getting to a point where the children, the inmates are running the asylum to some extent. The kids are telling the parents, this is how it's going to be. And the Lord says, not in my house. Well, and I think it's also, lastly, the ideal Jewish Israelite dream at this time was to live a long life in the land God had promised them, have kids, be relatively prosperous, comfortable and all that. And then after, when you're full of years, die and go sleep with your fathers and mothers. That's what they hoped for. That was their dream. Most people today, don't even care what happens to their bodies or they don't have any, concept. They're really in it for now. They want to do whatever they want to do now, live life to the fullest now. YOLO, you only live once, that's not their view. That's not their goal. Well, I think God is saying in this commandment and with the promise to the people of Israel, if that's what you want, then you better give it to your parents. If you want your kids to give it to you later on, then you better give it to your parents. And that's come up already, that if, you don't take care of your parents, you think your kids are going to come take care of you? Sherry and I tricked everybody. We didn't have kids, so we know nobody will be taking care of us. So I'm just going to buy a good horse and ride off into the sunset, I think. My time, buy it from Alma's relative over there who's got 6 and is trying to sell 1. So Seville, so I'll be like Shane riding off into the, come back, Shane. So it is in a sense, I guess you could say, loving others as you would, or treating others as you would like to be treated. and particularly your parents, if you want your kids to respect and honor you. And I think most parents do. I think it's really hard when your kids backtalk you and disobey you and give you no respect and no honor. Well, then you respect your parents. And again, there's all these permutations of parenthood and family life now that were not God's intentions, create difficult situations. I don't think if your parents are dishonorable, you honor them by transcending their dishonor, by not bringing dishonor upon them. If they don't love the Lord, if they're not Christians, what greater way to honor them than to become a Christian and model authentic Christian living right in front of them? And maybe you bring them to Christ. That's not the normal order of things, but God can do anything, can he? So we're still kind of, I think it's a relatively simple commandment, but it's still what it really means and how it works. Like so much of the Bible, it looks simple, but then you try to apply it to the reality of human existence. And all of a sudden, well, that's not quite so simple. It may be simple. It is not easy. It's impossible, except for the grace of God. Okay.
I like how you started this section in your outline. It says the honoring of ancestors is a common trait in most successful civilizations.
Well, they passed it down. That's why they're still around as a civilization. They didn't succeed as a civilization saying, and I've heard this, we'll close on this, and I probably have told you this before. Occasionally, I will refer to guys like Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, who were the leaders of the Stone Campbell Restoration Movement, from which the Churches of Christ and a few other groups sprung. And I will say, well, Alexander Campbell said this, and I've been told by someone at one point in their life who was an elder, who said, I don't care what Alexander Campbell said. And I would say to him, do you care what your dad said? Well, yeah. Do you care what your granddad said? Because if you blow off the Alexander Campbell, but listen to the preacher that you heard growing up, then you're basically saying, my father's okay, I'll listen to him, but my granddad's an idiot. And maybe your granddad was an idiot. My grandfathers were not idiots. They weren't always perfect. My father's not always perfect. He just seems that way to me, but I'm sure he's not always perfect.
It's important to know the rest of the story and what you're commenting there is, because the guy could be saying he didn't care what Campbell or anybody else said. He wanted to go by what the Bible said. But if he's saying, I don't care what Campbell said, my preacher said, then that's...
Well, he was influenced by other preachers who were influenced by other preachers who were influenced by other preachers who were at some point influenced by Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone. And I can tell you those guys at some point were influenced by Martin Luther. Nobody understands the Bible purely out of their own intellect from a vacuum. We all bring ourselves to the scriptures. Almost all of us have somebody showing them to us and guiding us through them and answering questions and explaining difficult points. And that is great. That's exactly how it's supposed to work. The Ethiopian eunuch didn't run up on water and say, here's water, why don't I get baptized? Until he talked to Philip, right? The gospel is shared faith to faith. We come to it from others. And we come to it from people we'll never meet, people who died decades, centuries before we were even born. And that's fine. Quit resisting it. Quit trying to reinvent the wheel every generation. It's already here. We got it on cars now. We got 4 of them. Don't try to start over all the time. At the same time, don't just take what has come down the pike. I love old classic cars. The cars today are much better than the old classic cars. They're more reliable. They get better gas mileage. They're more comfortable. They got safer. In every way you can measure a car, the cars from now are better than the cars that were around 50, 60 years ago, except one thing. Those cars were cool.
Yes.
These cars aren't cool
Big
today.
engines.
Huh?
They had big engines.
They had big engines. And as a Dodge man, you know, they didn't always want to start. Neither did they. And so it's kind of, you know, that's, you know, it's, we inherit, we build, we still innovate, but we can do it respectfully. And listen to those voices. If your father is not just your only person, do you feel like this commandment means only your biological parents, or does it mean, can you be as rude and insolent as you want to your grandparents? Your great-grandparents, if you're lucky enough to know them? No. And this is a family, and we have ancestors and a cloud of witnesses that long predate our lives. And there is nothing wrong with considering what they have to say and giving it weight and respect and honor. And if you think you're the only one that's figured anything out, you're so much smarter than everybody else, and you're the biggest idiot in the room. Because a lot of these people were a lot smarter than we are.
Tell us how you read.
Well, that's how I really feel. And I'm not saying we would be bound by everything they said, especially Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone. They both came out of Scottish Presbyterian backgrounds. So they had that shaping how they looked at Scripture. How many Christians, particularly in the Bible Belt, are white, Scottish, Irish Americans? A lot of them. So they have a similar kind of way of looking at the Scriptures. They've inherited it from generations. So, you know, I feel like we do honor them. We don't always honor them. What it means to honor them is a kind of a particular journey. And it changes how we see that, and what it means can evolve over time. In a lot of cultures, you could never let your parent move into it. There are no such thing as nursing homes. If your parent is in a nursing home, it's because their kids don't love them. And a lot of people, elderly people, would like that to be the rule here. But a lot of elderly people, and my parents now qualify, I guess. I have a hard time thinking of them that way, but I guess they qualify. The last thing they want to do is be a burden on their kids. So that's a cultural change, isn't it? That's different. Okay. Thank you for your attention and your comments. Mr. Kelso, will you lead us in a closing prayer, please?